Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Surgical Ergonomics podcast, where we will be discussing everything related to surgical and procedural ergonomics, the people, ideas, and technology that will help enhance your physical wellness and career longevity. I am your host, Geeta Lal. I'm an academic endocrine surgeon, speaker, consultant, and surgical ergonomics coach. Having experienced work-related musculoskeletal injury myself, I am committed to increasing awareness of and developing solutions to counteract the impact of poor ergonomics on the professional and personal lives of healthcare workers in procedural areas. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Surgical Ergonomics podcast. Today, I'm very happy to have as our guest Dr. Jackie Cha. She is the Patricia Flatley Brennan Assistant Professor in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Her research focuses on measuring physical human-robot interactions, particularly in healthcare environments, with a view to improving worker performance, safety, and system efficiency. Her team investigates application of robotics, both surgical robotic system and wearables, in clinical environments and the changes of physical and cognitive interactions between human teams and robots. Her research has been funded by several sponsors, such as the National Science Foundation, including the NSF Career Award, National Institutes of Health, and the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality. Hello, Jackie, and welcome to today's podcast episode.
Hi, Geeta. Thank you so much for having me here.
Of course, this has been, in the making for a long time. I've been enthusiastic about having you on, so my pleasure. So, Jackie, just as we get started today, I was wondering if you'd be willing to share with our listeners a little bit about yourself, including kind of where you were born, where you grew up, your training background, and how you arrived at your current position.
Yeah, sure. So again, I'm an assistant professor in the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I lead a research group focusing on various human factors and ergonomics projects, primarily in healthcare. So how I actually got here, I was born in Korea and my family moved to Michigan when we were younger. And then I had the opportunity to go to University of Michigan for my undergrad studying biomedical engineering. So why I wanted to study BME was actually because when I was little, I was actually diagnosed with scoliosis. So I have a very small curvature in my spine, and the ortho was like, hey, like it's not severe enough, let's just watch it. And then what happened was I wanted to go and to become that ortho surgeon essentially when I grew up. But then what happened was during puberty, my leg kind of compensated for that curvature. So I actually have a leg length discrepancy. And so I was a runner, and as I was running, like my ankle would hurt. And then my friends would actually say, hey, Jackie, like you walk funny. And so I actually went through a series of tests and meeting with various specialists. And essentially, like I got the diagnosis of my leg length discrepancy. And then I realized, like, well, there should have been a better way, or how do I actually now interact with everything around me, considering like this very minor thing? And so that's when I actually got really interested in biomechanics, because it was, well, like how is my body compensating for the world around me and my own like nuances itself, right? And so that's when I decided, okay, like what are different ways that technology could be helping? And that's when I actually got exposed to human factors and ergonomics in general. And that field usually is housed in industrial engineering. So that's how I pivoted to industrial engineering for my doctorate at Purdue University.
I see. I understand that prior to your current role, you were actually at Clemson University. And was that your first job out of training?
Yeah, so what was also really interesting was, so during that time, it was like right during COVID. I remember I was like, I'm gonna graduate, I will do this final study, and then everything got shut down because of
I see.
COVID. Luckily, I had the Clemson position and I was going to start like in January 21. I was originally planning on actually being at the FDA as an intern for over the summer, but what happened was with the shutdown and things, I was like, hey, can I stay longer? And they, of course, like extended that opportunity for me. So I was really thankful. So for a while, actually, I was a lead reviewer and a biomedical engineer in the Food and Drug Administration, the robotic surgical assisted device team. And so I was able to look at the regulatory side of things as well as prep for my academic career. And I was at Clemson for almost 5 years, and then I just transitioned here to Madison.
Wow. Okay, that's an amazing story that you were propelled in a way into biomedical engineering and career in industrial and systems engineering based on your own experiences. I'm sure, our listeners will realize that this transition for our sake, as we continue to record the episode, I think we will all realize that it was a fortuitous transition and to our benefit as surgeons. So you mentioned, of course, this kind of interest in human factors and ergonomics and biomechanics is kind of what drove your career change. And then how did you get involved, though, in working with surgeons? Because you were propelled by your own, sort of challenges. Why then did you end up focusing on surgeons and robots?
Yeah. So I think what happened was, so like in the operating rooms,
Hmm.
even from an undergrad. So as an undergrad, I had the opportunity to be helping on different projects in surgery. So the advisor that I was working on, Dr. Tom Armstrong, had various projects in surgery and upper limb assessments. But he was looking at these various projects, and then, of course, then I actually ended up working under my PhD advisor when he was a graduate student at Michigan. And so he was also interested in a lot of different surgical projects. And so, of course, that naturally transitioned to what we were looking at while I was at Purdue, and then thinking about the intersection of ergonomics, how do we actually understand how to do the measurements of muscle activity, postures, and things like that in a very highly intense environment
Right,
itself. And
right.
so we did various projects. So our projects weren't only on looking at physical ergonomics, it was also thinking about cognitive load and things like that. And so while I was in the operating room, though, right, because I was the poor grad student that was going and doing data collection for hundreds and hundreds of hours, I was able to see and hear, right, like folks being like, oh, my back hurts, or actually surgeons telling trainees, like, you shouldn't be standing that way, or let me know if your arms are shaking, because I see also the arms shaking when people are like holding the scopes, like if you need to transition out. And so seeing all of that really did make me aware of the realities of the physical realities of the
Hmm.
clinical
Hmm.
work, and then also thinking about actually there's a lot of different type of domains where you actually are doing highly cognitive tasks, but you're actually not under high physical load. But surgery, we're actually making the workers do that, right? You're actually
Right.
performing really highly cognitively loading tasks, but also under physical load. And that's just really hard for the workers themselves. So you all, and really trying to understand how can we help? And of course, robotics is part of that. And so trying to think about different types of interventions. And that's how I got into this. Yep.
Yeah, understood. So thank you for sharing that. I will share with our listeners that Dr. Cha is actually very heavily involved, and we're grateful for that, actually, in the Society of Surgical Ergonomics. And I first came across her work when she was presenting on something called exoskeletons. So for our listeners, Dr. Cha has done a lot of work around exoskeletons. And in fact, recently, the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society and the Society of Surgical Ergonomics did like a joint webinar on the topic. I urge you all to look at the Society of Surgical Ergonomics website for this webinar recording. It should become available soon if it isn't already. So, this is what I want to delve in with you, Jackie. Now, to start off with, could you help our listeners understand what exoskeletons actually are and how they relate to your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So exoskeletons are wearable devices. So essentially lightweight, hopefully, frameworks that provide physical support to the body. I said hopefully because there's different types of exoskeletons. There's passive exoskeletons that really just use springs and mechanical elements that are just supposed to redistribute loads of your body. And so those tend to be a little lighter weight. You have active exoskeletons that actually have electrical components that will propel and use motors to control different movements. So active exoskeletons have actually been used a lot in the rehabilitation space, like PT for patients. And it's been seen in pop culture, in Iron Man, and things like that. But the ones that we use and look at in the operating room, we're not there yet, right? We're saying, how do we actually help aid and minimize the musculoskeletal injury and strains that you all have in the operating room? And so typically we use these lighter weight passive exoskeletons. And the ones that we typically look at are the ones for, again, shoulder support or back support, because thinking about the specific tasks of surgery, these might be the areas, or these we know from surveys and observations and essentially measurements, that these are the areas that you all need help in. There's also neck exoskeletons that are emerging as well. And so I would like to actually describe them as task-specific assistive tools. I think there's considerations of, well, why can't I just have this one device that actually helps me at all of the places? They're really right now designed for very specific locations. Yep.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you that question because, in my mind, in pop culture, like when I first met you and heard you talk about exoskeletons, I had this vision of, maybe a quadriplegic person, for example. They've been paralyzed from the neck down and they have this exoskeleton. And, the headline says, well, look, the exoskeleton helped this person move, right? Like that was my idea of an exoskeleton. And then
Yeah.
only after I met you and other engineers who are working in this area that I realized that there are, like you said, active and passive. And now, as you explained, the passive exoskeletons really are meant to support specific areas of the body during certain physically challenging tasks. So I have to ask, what is the data around these exoskeletons in industry? For example, are they used on factory lines or other, worker tasks? And how do they perform in that arena?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I think, so as a caveat to these devices have been emerging more for that space and that domain. So it's been actually used primarily in overhead assembly, like especially in automotive, right? You could think
Ah,
when it's like this,
yes.
right? Like I'm pointing, I'm lifting my arms up as overhead work. Manual materials handling, right? So moving like big objects from one location to another, and essentially where workers are holding tools away from their body.
Mm.
These are where the devices have been really emerging and have been shown through data that they help minimize musculoskeletal injuries. And again, the automotive sector was a very early adopter in this work. And so thinking about those type of domains, people have been using more of these devices as PPE, so personal protective equipment. And so thinking about transitioning it to the OR, there's actually way more mixed
I
data.
was, yeah, I was just thinking that because I'm thinking, a factory line,
Yeah.
assembly line is very different, as you pointed out, from the environment in the operating room because of those two things that you mentioned, there is physical load, but there is a huge cognitive component. And so many, for lack of a better word, we're talking about exoskeletons, so many moving parts in the
Yes.
operating room. So, I know you're one of the people in this field who has done the most work with exoskeletons in the OR. So I'm going to ask, what did you find were kind of the challenges in translating something that was already, as you said, adopted in the industrial environment to the operating room, and how did you sort out how it could be translated into the OR environment? I mean, were you doing studies in kind of a sim lab, something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, so very good question in terms of the way we've been approaching this was very systematic and trying to be holistic. So my lab has done studies both qualitative and quantitative, so really understanding user needs as well as how do we actually get quantitative evidence if this work is working or not in terms of helping workers. And then of course thinking about how do we, in human factors in general, we really try to understand what again are that general like, user needs. What does the evidence say in a very systematic way in a simulation lab? And then thinking, can we do some testing in the real environment? And
Mhm.
so my lab has done experiments and projects throughout all of that. In a qualitative way, we actually saw a lot of barriers that are not typical in industries of like construction, automotive, things like that. as you all know, the OR is a sterile field. There's so
Mhm.
many folks in the room. And so when you're actually thinking about how do these devices actually go under the surgical gowns, for example, like that was also an initial challenge, right? So do folks just need to size up in their gowns? What happens when the gowns won't fit or like doesn't close all the way? One of the biggest challenges too is if we're gonna think about this in terms of PPE, then how does it go through infection control? Where does it lie? Like what's the storage? And then there's also these cognitive perceptual aspects of, well, if I need an exoskeleton or I want to wear an exoskeleton, will folks think that I'm weaker, right? Like there's that social aspect as well. And then also thinking, well, if I'm wearing this thing, there's actually it's interesting. Folks actually think that it's bigger than it actually is. And so when people are wearing it, they're actually more cognizant of where they are in their bodies or where their body is respective to the environment around them. And so there's
Mm,
a little bit of different movements as well. I think
mm,
also the biggest challenge with these current devices is, again, they were built for a different environment and a different work and job. A lot of the times, again, we're thinking overhead work, they don't activate. So essentially with the shoulder support, they're not providing the resistance or support until you get to a particular angle. And so in surgery, as I learned, you try to keep your elbows in. And so when you try to keep your elbows in, it might actually not activate, and you might actually be pushing against the
mhm.
exoskeleton rather than it helping you. And so we're really just trying to understand, well, what are the tasks that it could help you on? Who are the people it should actually help folks with? It might not be the surgeon. It actually might be the scrub tech or the
Mhm.
resident or the trainee who just has to be wearing these all the time. Or like, is there an adaptive way to go through this? And of course, we also saw through these qualitative ways that the older folks like the way that they're doing and a little bit more resistant in trying to get new things to help them out, right? Like you guys have gone through decades of trying to optimize your body so that you minimize the pain. And so it is, well, like, how can we actually introduce new technology to the earlier workers, so medical students or residents, and teach them good ergonomics early on so that they can
Mhm.
actually have a longer career?
Yeah, this is fascinating to hear. Like I had these visions, I mean, I'm at that curmudgeon surgeon stage myself, but I'd like to think I'm open to new things. Well, I learned how to podcast in my 50s, so I've been open to new technologies. So I'm having this vision of you kind of in the lab trying to figure out in the sim environment, you have, as you said, a very body part specific exoskeletons. You have ones that support the back, you have ones that support the arms and shoulders, you have others that support the neck. These are things used in industrial engineering. So, what did you end up then ultimately, based on kind of the qualitative and quantitative work you had in the sim lab? What was your idea of what would be an exoskeleton that might be useful in the OR?
Yeah.
What were its characteristics? What did it
Yeah.
need to have?
Yeah.
And then comes the question, are there ones that are available in market and what is the data surrounding those?
Yeah, very good and deep questions that I think so honestly, with the data that is out there, again, a lot of folks in this field, we're using commercial devices. So I
Okay.
encourage anyone who is listening to this, if they want an entrepreneur and is really excited about exoskeletons in the operating room, please design one for the operating room. So these use cases essentially, or these devices have been kind of trying to fit for the job. So the
Right.
device they're trying to figure out, or we're even trying to figure out what part of the job is the device helpful for? Not can we
Mhm.
design a device that is helpful for the entire job? And so thinking about the commercial devices that are currently on the market, again, typically those that are used in other industries, we actually have varying different evidence. So we like for surgeon postures, for example, we went through a systematic study where is it actually going to help if surgeons are in extreme awkward postures for static durations of time? And like especially if they're thinking about like open surgery, retracting, or even
Mhm.
laparoscopic surgery,
Mhm.
there's very specific degrees of essentially flexion and abduction that it'll
Mhm.
help.
Mhm.
And then these devices, it actually depends on the type of device. So even though we have two different types of exoskeletons that are going to help the shoulders, for example, one might actually be helping for abduction, where one might actually be helping for flexion.
Oh, wow. So specific. Okay.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the design of the device. And
Mhm.
we were talking, so other researchers and I were talking about, well, yeah, like when we think about these devices, we know that you all are within like the fifth, like 0, 15 to 30 range when you are
Mhm.
actually operating. And if these devices don't activate until they're 45, you're pretty much resisting against it. So, at least in my opinion, it looks like maybe surgical tasks for the surgeon may not
Mhm.
be the most beneficial. I think for these devices, it might actually be thinking about, well, folks that are actually doing the retracting itself. So, technicians or residents that are actually assisting in these cases. I will say there's actually been growing evidence though for neck exoskeletons. So, ones that will
Mhm.
actually help support and keep your neck neutral.
Mhm.
They have actually been more helpful in terms of the evidence that we're finding in keeping more neutral ergonomic postures than maybe an arm support. I think also another interesting thing is, again, it really depends on the adoption factor of the clinical collaborators that I was working with. We knew as engineers, like the shoulder support exoskeletons will may actually potentially help you the most. They actually thought that the back support exoskeletons might help them the most. And
Mm.
so we actually did the studies in the labs, testing both of these in the postures that the clinicians would be in, and actually provided evidence like, oh, even though you think that the back support might actually be more helpful, it actually is not. And so I think it's these type of discussions and conversations and getting the evidence with the users themselves to say which one would be the best. But right now I would say like there I would not suggest like there is one exoskeleton that will help solve all your problems.
And we'll be back right after the short break. Surgeons and proceduralist colleagues, we trained for years to master what we do, but most of us are never taught how to protect our bodies while doing our jobs. Neck pain, shoulder fatigue, back stiffness after long cases. For many of us, this isn't the exception, it's routine. That's why, starting on February 16th, 2026, I'm launching the first cohort of a virtual hybrid coaching program in surgical and procedural ergonomics, designed for clinicians who want to perform at a high level without sacrificing physical health or career longevity. The program includes 2 small group sessions plus 2 individualized one-on-one coaching sessions using PostChecker, which is an AI-based motion capture system that provides personalized, actionable ergonomic insights both inside and outside the OR. I'm Geeta Lal, an endocrine surgeon with over 2 decades in the operating room and firsthand experience with the pain that comes from operating. I'm joined in this endeavor by Linda Miller, an occupational therapist and certified professional ergonomist, and together we bring real-world OR-tested solutions to you. If you're ready to invest in your performance and your longevity, email me at geeta@surgicalergonomics.com to get details and register. Your body is not disposable. Your career shouldn't be either. So it's interesting. As I'm listening to, you describe these things, what comes to mind is that when I look at kind of the literature and when I have interviewed surgeons on the podcast and even outside of the podcast relating to their symptoms, I will tell you that the biggest hitters for surgeons in terms of pain from operating is really neck and back, okay? And shoulders and arms comes, I should say, a close third, but
Yeah.
really the heavy hitters. And we're talking whether it's open surgery, laparoscopic surgery, neck and lower back are big hitters. So I'm not surprised that your surgeons said, that they thought that the back support exoskeletons would help the most. Now, when it comes to adoption of, robot assisted surgery, and another area, in which you study surgeons and their environments, what we see is if we look at the sites of pain, the rates of lower back pain are lower because they're, of course, sitting rather than standing,
Mhm.
and they have an adjustable console. But the area of neck pain, still persists, right? Depending on the
Yep.
model of the robot or type of robot they're using, the neck still takes a big hit, even in
Yep.
that type of surgery. Same with endoscopy. I see that, because the setup is very similar to laparoscopic surgery, you have a screen, etc. So again, even there, the neck is a bigger,
Yeah.
issue. So if I were, asked, I would say, if you showed me a bunch of exoskeletons, I would say find the one that supports the surgeon's neck and lower back. And that will be the one that will, probably provide, the most bang for the buck. So as you said earlier, for anyone listening to this podcast, whether you are a surgical resident, a biomedical engineer, someone already in human factors work, as Dr. Cha has pointed out, this area is wide open for you to do your work in and help us surgeons take care of, and other proceduralists take care of patients while supporting our physical health. For our listeners, I will share that I have actually trialed a commercially available, I think it's marketed as a neck exoskeleton, but there is also a back belt. You
Yep.
wear it like a vest. And in that webinar that you did, Jackie, I think Dr. Phil Haig, who is a surgical oncologist, tried out, and him and several of his surgical colleagues ended up purchasing this exoskeleton because at least qualitatively they felt better.
Yep.
Okay. And I will share that too, that I've tried it two different times and I put it through its paces. I deliberately did not pay any attention to my posture. I kept the table height really, at bad
Yeah.
heights for me. And I wanted to just see how I felt the next day. So before I share my experience, I wonder, if you have
Mhm.
participated in any studies of these various neck exoskeletons and, or if you haven't, like what does the data show?
Yeah, I'm gonna actually defer to you on that because I haven't really looked on the neck exoskeletons. When I saw it though, I think the big thing for me was, does it actually help? Like it's essentially, right, I think you have a headpiece or a headband that goes around your
Hmm.
forehead, and there's essentially a rod that goes like on the back and it keeps your neck back. Like right, it's essentially extending your neck. Is that the mechanics essentially?
Yes, that is the one we're talking about.
Yeah, got
Yeah.
it. Ooh, okay. So I would say on a systems perspective, I think
Hmm.
it also depends on how everything else in your environment changed. So for example, did your monitor placement go higher, right? Like, and so I think again, like with these devices, I will say like a larger comment of it's not just like a good tool or it's a tool in the toolkit. Like it's not like a all-in solution. But yeah, I'm curious, how did your neck exoskeleton experience go?
Right. So, my experience was similar to what Phil said on that webinar.
Mhm.
So, what I noticed was that when I took the exoskeleton off, and it's funny that I say this right off the bat, is that when I took the exoskeleton off, I realized suddenly how much my head actually weighs. Okay. So I
Wow.
suddenly felt the weight of my head at the top of the spine. It's not something you
Yeah,
normally think about, but I
yeah.
just wanted to make, I just wanted to state that observation. I think for me, what I noticed was the next day, in addition to less pain, I actually had less fatigue. And that was an
Oh.
interesting observation for me. And for our listeners who might be interested, there is a hot off the press study from the immediate past president of the Society of Surgical Ergonomics, Dr. Hallbeck, who we all know and love, who's done a lot of work in this area, specifically looking at these commercially available neck exoskeleton. And, I'll include the link of the study in the show notes for anyone who's interested. They did a qualitative component as well as a quantitative component. And at least in this small study, I think it was only 12 surgeons who served as their own internal controls. So they did some surgery with an exoskeleton and some without. That there was certainly, similar to my observation, reduced pain. But I think in the objective measurements, they also noted a reduction in sort of the time spent in high risk neck posture.
Yep. Yep.
So I think we need more studies like this and data, but it's really, fascinating that these things have been used in industry for a long time. We're trying to figure out applications in
Yeah.
surgery. And I must say, from a usability standpoint, these exoskeletons, at least the ones that I see on, or at least I should say this one on the market, had, the ease of wearing was very apparent. It was like you put on a vest, you
Mhm.
tighten a spring, and you gown and glove and operate as usual.
Yep. Yep.
So more to see on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think also one of the things too of like I guess like open areas of research, and I'm also like I'm happy to hear that about this one. But again, like when we're translating these devices, the I guess workforce between industries are different. And so I remember testing a lot of the initial exoskeletons and they
Hmm.
wouldn't fit me, right? Like I'm a short petite woman. And
Right, right.
so like even just the way that it's been designed, it's usually fits for certain demographics. And so
Hmm.
thinking about even the materials of the exoskeletons, there's soft ones now with like textile based versus the rigid ones. And thinking about the one that you're talking about, it's I'm glad to hear that it fit you essentially. Yeah.
Right. Well, they apparently came in small, medium, and large sizes. So they've thought about that. But the rod and the spring attachment, I think Phil points that out in the webinar that for some of us, it was poking our spine. And so
Oh,
they listened to user feedback and I think decided to pad that area, which I think, as Phil said, did help.
yep.
So I guess as we kind of close out this episode, I want to hear from you, where do you see opportunities in this area and what would you advise us surgeons and trainees in terms of how we can help advance this field? Because in the end, it's to
Yeah.
our benefit, right?
Yes, yes.
So I want to know from, your standpoint,
Yeah.
how we can kind of help the work that you're doing and where you see the future of this going.
Yes, definitely. I think in terms of the like where I see it going, I definitely again, it's a tool in the toolkit. Like it should not
Yeah.
replace good ergonomic like postures and designs and
Hmm. Hmm.
practice in the OR. I do see more exoskeletons coming on the market. Again, there's active ones that are claiming to actually help for patient handling, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
even just and so thinking about what are opportunities or use cases that these devices may help. And again, they might not be the solution for in the OR. Just keeping that as an open mind, at least for me as a researcher, is okay, how do we collect the evidence? And then of course, like collecting the evidence is like it would be continuing these conversations and being able to have these collaborations. So again, the big thing about human factors and ergonomics and usability work is we hear from the users. Like we
Right.
as engineers can assume that this will be helpful for you all, but we might not know that yes, it's poking in your spine when you're actually performing surgery. So when you see studies like, okay, we're looking at these type of things, and your colleague who's working with other engineers reaches out and says, hey, can you do an interview or do you want to pilot this type of work? That would be like what really helps us in terms of like getting and pushing this work forward. And of course, like reaching out to me and other folks that are in SSE and doing this type of work. If there are any type of collaborative opportunities, I know we're all really excited.
Wonderful. I'm sure, many of our listeners in the surgical domain, trainees and practicing surgeons, will be very interested and definitely willing to collaborate because we're always looking for solutions. And I really appreciate that you point out that there is no, single silver bullet, right? This is a tool in the toolkit because I think sometimes, we're always looking for a single solution. And I say this in every talk that I give. I said, physical ergonomics as it relates to surgeons, it really is, you have to think about it like a Swiss cheese model
Yep.
during the pandemic, right? There are going to be multiple layers. You have to look at your workflow. You have to look at how you're positioning. Are you doing posture resets as needed? Are you taking breaks? Because technology, as it comes out, they're going to add to the armamentarium and that toolkit, but there's not going to be one thing that works for every surgeon and every type of surgery. So, that open mind that you mentioned is, really, really important. And, I think this was also sort of apparent in the webinar that I think people found that the neck exoskeletons may not be as useful for robot-assisted surgery
Yeah.
because that headpiece, you're trying to get close to it and then you're
Yeah.
wearing something additional on the head. So
Yep.
hence it is a tool in the
Yep.
toolbox. It's not going to help for every single situation.
Exactly.
So, with that in mind, Jackie, I am so grateful that, in the midst of your transitions, you took out some time to spend with me in recording this episode and share your knowledge and expertise with our listeners. And I hope to continue to sort of have you back at some point as we have more advancements in this area to talk about them. Again, once again, my many thanks.
Thank you, Gita. It was so great to be here.
Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media, Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We love feedback, so please reach out to us for topics, ideas, speakers, or if you ever want to be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.